we're going to be looking at economic indicators in the business cycle. So what this entails, I'm going to go through my book, is the circular flow, GDP, its limitations, unemployment, price indices like CPI, inflation, who does inflation hurt, the cost of it, real and nominal GDP, and the business cycle. So this is like unit 3 and unit 4 of what we had in our binder. So what we're going to look at first off is the circular flow. And so I'm going to get a piece of paper. We've talked about the circular flow in class, and I made you draw this out. This is that flow of factors of production and payments that occurs in our economy. We can see that our economy's performance can be measured by different indicators such as GDP, inflation, and unemployment. But before we get into all of this, the circular flow really shows this. And so y'all had a drawing, and I make you start off in your house, right? And the households own the factors of production, right? So they sell these to businesses. So they sell the FOP, right? C-E-L and L, capital, entrepreneur, land, and labor. They don't do this for free for this business, right? They get national income back. Sorry, I am not writing very well. Okay, and this national income for capital, it is interest. For entrepreneurs, it is profit. For land, it is rent. For labor, it is wages. They go home, and we know that this is the resource market. In the resource market, the factors of production are sold. And then we have this product market up here. And in the product market, the households take GDP, right? They give their payments. Money transfers to business, and business give in exchange goods and services. And this is the product market. And we're really going to look at all of this that's going on to figure out how our economy is looking at. We're going to look at GDP, we're going to look at inflation, and we're going to look at the unemployment rate. We remember that GDP measures the final output of the economy, what is the total dollar value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders within a given year. And so GDP counts. So GDP, we know GDP is equal to C, consumer expenditures, I, business expenditures, G, government expenditures, and then net exports. This is one way for me to calculate GDP. There is another way, which is the national income approach. And this is where I just add all the incomes up: wages, rent, interest, and profit. Okay, so there's two ways to calculate GDP. There's another approach, like I have them right here, the expenditure approach, which we just did. Everybody C plus I plus G plus X, and the income approach, adding W, wages, rent, interest, and profit. And then the added value approach, that I add each item as it's being made, but that would inflate our GDP. So the added value approach is not often used. So what we're going to be looking at is that GDP is the total flow of income and expenditures that can be represented in the circular flow diagram. This is what I just drew, right? I could see that I could do the national income approach, right? Wages, rent, interest, and profit. Or I could come up here and add every good and services that is made in America. So we've covered this, we have this. We know that there's a couple of things not counted in GDP. So what we're going to look at is the things not counted. Transfer payments, such as when the government gives Social Security benefits or unemployment benefits, or like just recently the stimulus package. That is something not counted. Used items, if I go to a garage sale, that's not counted. Intermediate goods, the goods to make something else. So when a seamstress buys the fabric to be able to make her mask, that doesn't count. Illegal activities, such as me paying someone to babysit my kids and not reporting it to the government, that's illegal. Lemonade stands, okay? And financial transactions, things that we things such as stocks, bonds, okay? So what we're going to look at is the limitations of GDP right here, this next little portion. The limitations of GDP. We see that this indicates our nation's economic performance, and it has some limitations, which I just talked about, the things that we didn't do, and the failing for the non-market transactions not counted for. So I just did this on the other side. So what we're going to look at now is unemployment. Unemployment also tells us about the economic performance, and we see that it measures the percentage of people that are out of the workforce. Okay, so there's different types of unemployment, which we're going to get to in a second, but we know that there's a natural rate of unemployment that exists when the economy is healthy, which our government says it's 5 to 6%. The labor force participation is another way to measure the labor market activity. It's basically what we do for this is we take the number of unemployed, right, to be able to determine this, and I don't think AP will ever ask you this. We take the number of unemployed over the employed, and then we multiply that times 100, okay? And that gives us the rate. So we usually, our government's like 5 to 6% is good. That tells us we're in the good phase of the business cycle. Right now, with what's going on in our economy, the unemployment rate is about 20%. So that tells us that we're in a contraction phase of the business cycle. So we're going to be looking at things such as GDP, inflation, and unemployment that will be real indicators to tell us where we are in the phase of the business cycle. Many people say that the unemployment rate is not a good indicator because there's such people such as discouraged workers that they've been looking for jobs and don't get jobs and stop looking for it. Part-time workers are counted part of being full-time employees, and that often inflates our employment rates. There are 3 different types of unemployment. One is cyclical, which deals with a phase of the business cycle. So people who lost their jobs currently are cyclically unemployed because of the business cycle. We see that people who've lost their jobs, like museums, okay, people who have lost their jobs at Six Flags, the movie theaters, those are people who are cyclically unemployed. Frictional unemployment means that you're in between. Those are people who are moving from job to job. The next one is structural, that your technological or educational things don't meet. So those are the people that we focus on as the unemployed. People who do not count as part of the labor force are school children, military, mentally ill, discouraged workers, and the elderly. And so we see that there's seasonal, which we've talked about before, unemployment as well. So the natural rate of unemployment is the unemployment rate that would exist when the economy is at full employment, which is 5 to 6%. And right now we're not at that, so we know that we are in a contraction. The deviation from the actual unemployment rate, it really deals with the cyclical unemployment, which currently that's what's going on. The natural rate of unemployment can gradually change over time because of things such as labor force characteristics, like if our country is becoming more advanced technologically, but the people's skills haven't met up with it. Okay, so this is unemployment. I think we were pretty good because we had a lot of examples of being able to identify this in our binder. So we know frictional, they're temporarily unemployed because of their in-between jobs. Structural is because of technology or their skills have become obsolete, and cyclical deals with the business cycle. Okay. Also, discouraged workers, we know those are people who are not looking for a job because they've given up. And part-time employment, they count towards the unemployment rate. So now what we're going to look at is the price indices, which this is CPI. And CPI is a price index that's a market basket that measures basically common items that are being bought, and it measures inflation from year to year, but also this market basket is bought monthly. And so CPI is calculated, this market basket of things that are used for the standard of living over a set period of time. And every month these items are bought. And we see that that we're not going to include the PPI in this because that's not in the scope of it apparently. Calculating these prices month to month really tells us about what is going on with inflation. And inflation is just a general rise in the price of goods. And so CPI is an index that measures, that shows these price changes for a fixed thing. And so what we do is we take, to calculate CPI, which we've done this before, CPI, we take the market basket, and then we take the market basket of the base year times 100. And this gives us what is going on. So let's just say a market basket was $20 and the base year was 100. So for me to figure out what has happened, so let me just give you some numbers. So 2009, it's 20. 2010, it's 40. 2011, it's 50. The base year is 100. So for me to set this up, I take the market basket of 20 over 100. That's going to give me 0.5 times 100. That's going to give me 50. Now I look at the next year. Base year, 40, right? And then I take it over, and that's going to give me, I take that times the base year, that's going to give me 100. And take 50. Base year is 250. That's going to give me 125. Okay? So CPI just measures the general rate of inflation, and as we can see, inflation, the biggest jump was from this year, 2009 to 2010. So we see inflation is the rate determined by calculating the percent change in the price index. So it's just the market basket over the base year times 100. We see other things affect inflation, such as real wages rising, and nominal inflation. Nominal is that inflation at that time period, which we've talked about. Anytime you see the word nominal, you should automatically think that is inflation. It's not calculated out. CPI measures the inflation and its shortcomings. It looks at substitutes and sometimes that we are overstating inflation. So what we're going to look at is, what is the impact of inflation? Inflation does cost. We see that inflation hurts a lot of people. Inflation means that certain people are not getting back what they had given. So lenders are actually hurt because they're getting paid back in money that is worth less. Savers are hurt by inflation because they're not getting increase in their inflation, and people living on fixed incomes. The one group of people who's actually helped by inflation is the people who borrow. Okay, there are two different types of inflation, which I don't know if that's the next thing. There are two different types of inflation. One is cost push, which we will see that in our aggregate supply curve, and one is demand pull. Okay. What we're going to look at is real and nominal GDP. We are seeing that real GDP measures items at a specific time, and then with inflation calculated out. And real nominal GDP is at that moment with inflation already into that. So nominal, again, measures it at the current price. Real is adjusted. So again, it says that right here. Nominal GDP is measured how much of the output. Real measures how much is being produced. The nominal measures the aggregate output at the current price because that I, inflation, is there. Real measures it using a constant price, which we calculate that. We've calculated it for taking the market basket, the GDP of the market year over the current year times 100. So one way to figure out what is going on is we're trying to figure out that if we're overstating GDP by using this calculation. Okay. Last thing, basically GDP, unemployment, and inflation really bring us into this business cycle. And the business cycle, we know, is just fluctuations in our economy. And so we have a chart in our binder that's like this, right? So we know that this is the expansion, this is the peak, this is the contraction, and this is the trough. And so there's certain things at the phases of the business cycle that are going on. And what we're going to look at that in the expansion, aggregate demand is going up. GDP is going up. Inflation is going up. Unemployment is going down. Okay? And then we know everything here is at the highest. All of those indicators are at the highest and unemployment is at the lowest. In a contraction, aggregate demand is going down. GDP is going down. Inflation is going down, but unemployment is going up. And here everything's at its lowest. So basically, we look at all of these indicators, GDP, inflation, unemployment, to tell us what is going on with our business cycle. Okay, so we're going to look at, I think this is the last topic. We're going to look at a kind of AP style question. So gross domestic product measures the amount of goods and services produced in an economy. Great, we already knew that. List and define the four components of GDP. GDP is C, which is consumers, I, which is business, G, which is government, and XN, which is imports minus exports. So there we go. We defined it and list the four categories. The next one, identify each of the following situations. Does it increase, decrease, or have no effect on the GDP of the United States? Purchase of a new car produced in the United States increases GDP, right? It's consumer purchase. The U.S. government's contracts with a firm for manufacturing of weapons increase in GDP because the government is spending. A purchase of stock on the New York Stock Exchange, no effect, right? We don't count. These is financial transaction. A world-class chef cooks dinner at home for his wife and his children. No effect because that does not go into GDP. Imported apparel sold at low prices in major retail outlet. That actually decreases GDP because it's from another nation. Okay. Hopefully this one made sense. We're going to move on to Unit 3. Bye.